Well, good afternoon to you. Good morning to me. I'm really happy to be here talking to you about some of the work I've been doing over the past years. So I really like to start my urban talks with this slide. It's a real photograph. It's a continuous mountain range in the background because I think it really nicely shows how strong the impacts of humans are on the landscape, right? We have this relatively non-urbanized and natural area to the right side of the screen and a very urbanized area to the left. And our natural understanding of what happens to plants and community assembly don't necessarily apply very well to this very urbanized areas because we introduce people. And today I'm going to try and make the argument that although we introduce people and people drastically alter things, that maybe there is a way that we can start to really predict and understand how plant communities assemble in urban areas. So I focus on plants. I'm a plant ecologist, and I focus on plants because in cities, particularly because so much is asked of plants. And so the urban environment has very many altered conditions that affect plants. There's higher levels of air pollution, there's elevated CO2, there's higher rates of nitrogen deposition, there's generally elevated temperatures and greater amounts of soil pollutants. And many of these can be stressors to plants and make it more difficult for them to grow. And despite them being maybe growing in more stressful conditions, plants are actually expected to ameliorate these conditions and make the conditions better for residents living in cities. So although air pollutants can be bad for plants, plants are also expected to clean up the air for us in cities. And so we place this really important role in what we expect plants to be able to do for us in urban areas. So in natural areas, we have a fairly good understanding about what drives patterns of plant biodiversity. So we know that in larger areas, there tends to be more species. We know that areas with higher productivity or energy or nutrients generally have greater species richness. The disturbance regime is really important, such as the ideas of intermediate disturbance hypothesis. How connected habitats are as important, and overall heterogeneity is a driver of biodiversity, where in more heterogeneous areas, there's greater biodiversity. All these tend to also apply in urban systems, which is great. Like our fundamental understanding of drivers of biodiversity also apply in these very human modified systems. But we also find that there's additional drivers, such as the education level of residents can affect plant biodiversity, the income of those living there, the age of people's homes, so how much time has passed to allow species to accumulate, societal norms and something called the ecology of prestige, wanting to cue to your neighbors that you belong in this neighborhood, and as well as how much time you have to spend gardening. And so really what I want to do is try and think of ways to incorporate these additional drivers into understanding plant community assembly. So my overall question for today's talk is, can we predict community assembly in complex urban environments? And so I'd like to just take a moment to refresh us with typical drivers of plant community assembly in natural areas. This is biological theory. So first we have a regional species pool, and here each species is represented by a different color circle. And first we have a dispersal filter. And so not every species from the regional species pool can disperse to a new location. And so we lose some of those species. Next, we have an environmental filter where not every seed that lands there can grow and germinate. And so now we lose even some more species. And finally, we have a biotic interactions filter where species have to compete with one another for the resources that are there. And some species can't compete. And so we lose even more species. And finally, we have together our local plant species richness is determined. And so these are the traditional filters that are assumed: dispersal, environmental, and biotic interactions. What I want to do is apply this to an urban system. And so first, the first thing is that we don't only have a regional species pool. We actually have two pools for species in urban areas. And so we have spontaneous species, and those are those that can grow and be dispersed on their own without human intervention. And those species are drawn from the regional species pool, very similar to what occurs in the natural filters framework. In contrast, additionally, we also have human imported species. So these are species that humans intentionally have brought to a city or to an area. and either planted or released if it's animals or insects or something else. And these species are actually drawn from all over the world. We can take plants or animals from a global species pool. Now, as we bring in and import different animals, there's many terrible examples of unintentionally imported species that escape and become part of the regional species pool. And so right off the bat, we're adding to the local regional species pool just by the actions of humans importing other species. So the first filter is, again, dispersal, and dispersal works the same way it would in natural systems, where from the regional species, what can actually get to a new location. But for human imported species, for those that are intentionally imported, they go through what I consider a commercial viability filter. So can these species be sold and monetized for people to want to add to the landscape? And so this is determined by market pressures, by ease to cultivate and to propagate. A lot of different things go into determining commercial viability. Now, some species that are intentionally imported can escape and become locally invasive and be joined part of the regional species pool. Not every species does this, but certainly some do. And then once they're part of the regional species pool, then they just disperse according to their own biological limitations. And so that's how I see dispersal working in urban areas. Then we have additional selection filters. So first, everything goes through what I call a manager species selections filter. And this is, what do people want to bring to the landscape, or what do people want to remove from the landscape? So I live in urban downtown Baltimore right now. My yard is basically the size of a postage stamp, so I don't have many plants anymore, but I used to live in a larger yard. And I would certainly weed undesirable species every spring and summer, and I would additionally plant species that I found to be desirable. And so this is how we take in species. We can either plant them or remove them, but generally it really reflects whoever the manager is and their preferences and desires. And then we have the local environment and biotic interactions filters. So again, just because someone brings a species to an area doesn't mean it's going to thrive in the local conditions, and doesn't mean it can compete with the local conditions. And I want to point out that I have these dashed arrows, these indirect effects, where the local environment is going to affect what's commercially viable, right? We're not going to import palm trees into Baltimore. They're just never going to stand the freezing tolerance, even if that's something we really wanted. And people also decide what they want, and they know what they want. And so what people are buying will also affect commercial viability. I'd also like to point out, okay, I'm getting ahead of myself. And so then all these filters together determine local urban plant community. And when people look around the plant communities of their own yards or their neighbors or what they see around the city, this can then feed back and affect what they want to put there, right? Like if you see lots of beautiful flowering crepe myrtles, which is a really common tree here in Baltimore that's not native, people generally also want that in their yard. Within all these filters within this box undergo human behavior and are influenced by human behavior. And so here I define human behavior by the intentions of humans and how they act on those intentions. So humans can obviously affect the commercial viability, right? This is a human construct of what we're going to sell. Humans obviously also affect what they're selecting and choosing to remove or put into a given location. But humans can also affect the local environment and biotic interactions. For example, many people water their yard or turn over the soil or apply fertilizer. All that changes the local environmental conditions. And finally, people can affect biotic interactions. They can prune plants to prevent shading from one another. They can add herbicide or fungicide to affect pest outbreaks and everything. So humans can overwhelm all these filters in this box. And collectively together, I think all these different components affect overall local urban plant communities. But so I say plants because I study plants, that's what I'm talking about for the rest of this talk. But really, I think this filter framework would apply to any organism in a city. So taking this framework for today's talk, I'm going to take us from the West Coast all the way to the East Coast, which is going to track my progression as a scientist during my postdoc and my first few years as a professor. So we're going to start out in Los Angeles. We're going to look at overall plant diversity in urban areas. Then we're going to move to Salt Lake City. We're going to look at residential yard biodiversity, and we're going to end up in Baltimore, where I am now, again, looking at residential yard biodiversity, but different drivers. So we're going to start in LA. And so here is a picture of the Beverly Hills before it was urbanized. And hopefully what strikes you about this picture is that there's not many trees. It's a pretty desolate landscape, right? And this is what is advertised as LA today. This is from the LA Tourism Board. It's this beautiful, lush urban jungle. And this beautiful, lush urban jungle is entirely human constructed, right? We reroute water all over the West. And so now there's a lot more water than would be there naturally. And many of these species that are brought in are not native. And so it's this totally different environment. And so the questions I want to address in Los Angeles are really about land use types and species types, trying to understand these regional versus human imported filters. So does land management affect what types of plants are found in LA? And what are the sources of plants in cities? And this work was done in collaboration with Diane Pataki, Daryl Jenneret, and Stephanie Pinsettle. And so to do this work, we synthesized several large data sets that were already collected about plants in Los Angeles. And so this is just a data synthesis. So in urban areas, we can say I'm working in an urban area and people have an idea what that means, but actually there's lots of variation within urban areas. So all these are photos from what would be considered urban Los Angeles or the urban Southern California. And urban areas include remnant natural areas, these pockets of areas that have not been very developed. And they also include highly cultivated areas that are all human constructed. And this is, I think, from the Los Angeles Botanical Gardens, this photo. These are really close to one another, but they're very drastically different habitats. And so we wanted to try and explore and understand how these different habitats function. And what we know that in the remnant natural areas, most of the plant species that are there are going to be growing spontaneously, right? People aren't coming in and planting plants here, but what's growing in the cultivated areas is going to include a mix of spontaneous and cultivated species. And so we investigated 4 land use types. As I said, this was a synthesis. We used data on remnant natural areas. We used data sets of urban trees, of residential yards, and community gardens throughout LA. So first thing we found is that there are way more species in cultivated areas than remnant natural areas. And so here is the sample area, and the remnant natural area is in green and the residential yards is in yellow. Even after we sampled over 15,000 meters, we're not even close to coming to an asymptote over here. There's so many plant species in LA. But when at the same sampling area, there's about double or over double the number of species that are found in residential yards and are found in remnant natural areas. So what people are doing in Los Angeles are really bringing in plant species. And then when we compare the remnant natural areas and all cultivated areas, of all the plant species we found, we classify the plant species as being either native or exotic, and exotic being not from California. So it was either native to California or not native to California. And then whether it displays invasive characteristics or not. And here an invasive species is one that's been defined by the California government as having an economic cost. So many non-native species are not invasive. And so in remnant natural areas, we see that the majority of the plants we found were native. There were many exotic, and of the exotic species we found, the majority were actually invasive exotic species. And so the hills of Southern California are unfortunately being invaded by lots of non-native grasses. In cultivated areas, we found very, very few native species. The large majority, the overwhelming majority of the plant species were exotic, but of all those exotic species, only a very small proportion were actually invasive. And so many of these plant species that are growing in these cultivated areas are not going to escape. They're not going to have a huge cost. They're just growing there. One of the reasons why this could be is that LA is a semi-arid city, and without irrigation, many plant species actually would not be able to survive there. And so this is potentially why so many of the plant species in cultivated areas are there only because they're dependent on the water and the interventions of humans. Next, we want to look at take this to split out cultivated areas a little bit more and see how this differs. So Now we're looking at, in this slide, this is all cultivated areas. I'm splitting that out into urban forests, residential yards, and the community gardens. And the same pattern pretty much holds, that there's most of the species are cultivated exotic species. And so we're finding that, as I said, we're bringing in lots and lots of plant species to Los Angeles, and very, very few native species overall. We also looked at where each species is native to, and we found that plants were being brought in from all over the world. So 116 of the plant species we found in LA are native to North America. Almost 200 are native to Eurasia. I took out the Mediterranean area because Los Angeles can have considered to have a Mediterranean climate. Only 58 came from the Mediterranean area. But we really see that plant species are being imported to Los Angeles from all over the world. There really is a global species pool. And when for trees, we actually had this data where we had long-term nursery data. And of all the trees we found in Los Angeles, 90% were offered by local nurseries, meaning that people could buy these trees. It really also suggests that local nurseries and commercial viability is a really important filter. And so here in Los Angeles, I found that the regional species pool and dispersal, natural dispersal, is really important in remnant natural areas. But in cultivated areas, there really is a global species pool, and commercial viability of these organisms is really important for whether or not a species is going to be found in a given area. So what did we learn about plant dispersal from Los Angeles? We found that land management matters for urban plant biodiversity, that there are more species in areas with greater management, and that these species in cultivated areas are exotic ornamental species. And we found that species are imported from all over the world. So now we're going to fly a little bit eastward. We're going to now land in Salt Lake City. This is where I did my postdoc, and I did some work on residential yard biodiversity in Salt Lake City. So here again is a picture of Salt Lake City before it was urbanized. Salt Lake City is in a valley surrounded by mountains. And so this valley is dominated by sagebrush, so a shrubby species. And this is what Salt Lake City looks like today. And I don't know how clear it is to you there, but what we're looking at here is a really dense urban forest and lots of tree canopy cover. And again, like Los Angeles, all these trees are pretty much planted and maintained and watered by humans. Naturally, a forest would not be growing on the valley of the Salt Lake area. And so here in another very human constructed city, I wanted to ask questions about selection and human behavior. So again, I want to drill into the nursery and commercial viability. I'm trying to understand whether different nurseries differ in the types of species they offer. I wanted to understand what kind of yards do people actually want, and then are they able to realize that? And then what controls patterns of biodiversity for residential yards? And here I was really looking at income, so how much money residents made, the age of the neighborhood, so how much time passed to allow species to accumulate into a given area, and overall the preferences of residents. And then I wanted to ask whether income affects the ability of residents to realize their preferences. So this interaction between preferences and income. So for this, my collaborators were again, Diane Pataki, Tara Trammell, Joanna Interwada, and Allison Blanchett. And before I get into this work, I want to briefly make the case of why I think residential yards are such a fascinating study system. So residential yards are an entirely human constructed ecosystem, right? They share really, really similar features across broad climatic gradients globally, pretty much. Most residential yards have something similar to a lawn. They generally have flower beds. They have trees or shrubs, so woody species as well. And then some of them have vegetable and garden beds. And so here are the three pictures of yards from the three cities I'm giving talk about today. So here's a yard in Baltimore, here's a yard in Los Angeles, and here's a yard in Salt Lake City. And there's, more woody biomass in Baltimore, but if you looked at these, you wouldn't necessarily think we were in three extremely different cities across the United States, right? They all really do share these similar characteristics. We also know within a single climatic area, there's lots of variation with yards because each yard has an individual homeowner or renter that is the manager of that area. And so here within Salt Lake City are 3 different yards that I visited that are starkly different. We have a very neat manicured grass dominated yard. We have a yard with very high amounts of woody biomass and a little bit overgrown. And then we have this classic like flower garden in front of the house, single lone tree. These yards have very different types of biomass that's being stored on them, very different types of plant biodiversity and the species that are being grown there. And so I think residential yards are a really exciting area to study because it really are places where human preferences are manifest and we can get a lot of variation. So for the work in Salt Lake City, I studied 9 neighborhoods across the Salt Lake Valley. These were all along the valley floor, so some fairly homogeneous environmental conditions. I tried to look at the interactive effects of age and income independently. So I went to neighborhoods that were either built before 1930, built in the mid 20th century, or built around the turn of the 21st century, and then 3 incomes, either low, middle, or high income. And then I went to these areas. I disseminated surveys to try and understand what people wanted in their yards. I gave individual oral interviews where I interviewed people about their yards, and then I collected a whole host of ecological variables in people's yards. And so in each yard, we really focused on the lawn because lawns are such an important part of yards. We focused on the flower bed. So what species are in these areas where people put flowering plants, and then trees. And when we measured the herbaceous flowering plant species, we tried to develop measures that would maybe be more indicative of things, of cues that people pay attention to. So we first identified every plant to genera or genus, and then we counted all the individual plants. But then we had these new approaches to studying floral biodiversity. We tried to come up with a sum of total area in color in a yard. So we counted the number of flowering stems. We counted the number of flowers per stem. We took a photograph of each flower color and flower type in each yard. And from this, we were able to calculate the total number of colors, the total number of flower shapes, and the total floral area of each yard. And so here's a picture of us. We took all these photos, we had these quarters. We really tried to really understand. We think that people are really paying attention to flower color, and we wanted to have a way to pick this up and detect this. Before I go into the results of the yards, I said that I was interested in what is the role of commercial viability and nurseries in controlling patterns of urban biodiversity. So to look into this, I went to locally owned stores that were these larger nurseries. And I also went to large chain stores or big box merchandiser stores to compare what types of trees are being offered there and what's the average cost of a tree. And so if I went to a locally owned nursery, I found that they were offering over 200 species, and the average cost of a tree was $173. And you can see this is a rank abundance curve. So the most abundant species has rank 1, and this is relative abundance. You can see there's not a strong pattern of dominance, and there's a long tail. They're offering pretty much high levels or low amounts of each tree species. There's not really, if you go to a locally owned nursery, you're not necessarily going to walk away with a single species. In contrast, when I went to box stores, I found that they were offering under 100 species. So they're offering for sale half the number of species, and the average cost of that tree was $73. So $100 less. And you can see now there's a really strong pattern of dominance, that if you went to one of these big box stores, you're much more likely to walk away with one of these 3 or 4 tree species, right? Because they are in such higher numbers and so much more abundant than these other species. What I also, then I asked people where they shop, and I found that wealthier residents shop at more nurseries. So these locally owned nurseries comparison to box stores. And this could be potentially a reason why we observe these biodiversity income effects across cities. If you're simply happen to be going to a place where there's more tree species being offered, you could potentially you have a larger pool from which to draw species, and this could be driving biodiversity patterns. I also want to just briefly point out this native, non-native difference that we found. So Populus tremuloides was the 3rd most common tree species being offered by these big box stores. This is a native species. So when I went to people's yards, I said, oh, look, they have all these native species here, but we have no idea where the genetic stock from these species are coming from. So I think this really calls like, and all these native species are were planted, right? Many of them are being planted. And so I think it should challenge us to consider like what is native or how are native species growing when we come across them in urban areas. Okay, so now we're gonna go to the yard results. So first we just asked people a series of questions, trying to understand people's preferences. So we asked people like, how important is it for you to have variety in your yard? From 0 being not at all important to 3 being very important. And we asked about overall, we asked about variety, which was vaguely defined. We asked about biodiversity and explained that that was a variety of species. And we asked about native plant species. And what you see here is that people really prefer to have variety in their yard, and they think variety is much more important than biodiversity, or that variety is more, and both are more important than native species. People in Salt Lake City were not very interested in native species. Then we tried to drill down, like, what was it about variety? So we asked people like, well, what about variety do you want? What's important? Is it important to have a variety of flower colors, and important to have a variety of plant types, of flower types, of leaf texture? And what we found is that flower color was the most important type of variety. People really wanted colorful yards. And things like leaf color and leaf texture were much less important. And so here again, some just pictures of all the beautiful flower colors we encountered in Salt Lake City. What's interesting is that people wanted flower color. It was the most important thing they wanted, and they wanted to have colorful yards regardless of their income. And so everyone wanted to have colorful yards, and it's just maybe that then we can try to understand, is income what's potentially limiting the ability to have colorful yards? We did find that income affected many aspects of biodiversity. So we found that the income of a neighborhood was strongly correlated with the overall number of tree species that we found in those yards, in those neighborhoods. We found that within a yard, the income of that neighborhood again was positively related to how many flowering plant species were planted. So higher income neighborhoods had more flowering plant species compared with lower income neighborhoods. And we found the opposite pattern for lawn species, which would make sense because people really want a beautiful monoculture in their lawn, right? And so there were more weedy species in lower income neighborhoods and fewer weedy species in higher income neighborhoods. So we found again that income was a big driver of overall biodiversity for all 3 aspects of the plants that we looked into. It was a driver of biodiversity for trees, for flowering plants, and for lawns. And here's just drilling into the lawn result a little bit more. Regardless of income, every yard had about 2 cultivated turf grass species. And what was the real big difference is this huge plummet in the number of weedy species, suggesting that people in the higher income yards are applying lots of herbicide and other things to control their weedy populations that the lower income residents are unable to afford. We also found that income explains several measures of our different aspects of trying to understand floral variety. So I showed you that it affected the number of flowering plant species. It also affected the number of overall flowering plants, the floral area, the number of flower colors in a yard, and the number of different inflorescent types. And here is a bar chart, a stack bar chart of the area of each color we found in each neighborhood. So each neighborhood had some like white flowers, some purple flowers, some red flowers, some yellow flowers, but you see that the overall floral area was around 50 meters in the high income neighborhoods, while it was just a little bit over 20 in the low income neighborhoods. So these high income neighborhoods have a much greater area that is just in flower. So as you drive through, they're going to be much more colorful, and that color is going to span a larger area. So what we think could be a big driver of biodiversity in urban areas is a desire for flower color. So here we found that there's more flowering plant species in higher income yards, and that the number of colors in a yard was strongly correlated with how many species are there. And so perhaps what's really happening here is that people just want to have colorful yards, and by trying to realize having colorful yards, they're bringing in a whole host of different plant species that will have different colors with them. So having high biodiversity is generally perceived as a good thing, but potentially these residents might not be trying to plant for biodiversity's sake, they might just be trying to plant to have really colorful yards. Next, I wanted to dive a little bit more into what's driving tree preferences. And so we surveyed and asked people a lot of things about attributes that we thought people would care about. So we asked about positive attributes of trees, like how much shade does the tree provide? Does the tree provide fruit? And is it beautiful? And for beautiful, we said, did it flower? Do the leaves turn a color in the fall? And does it have showy fruit? These were our composite measure of beauty. We also asked about how important negative attributes were, like how much water does a tree use? This could be important in Salt Lake City. How damaging are the roots, and how much debris do the trees drop, and how much they have to be cleaned up after? And so we asked people all these things. And again, we said, how important are these different attributes of trees to you, from 0 being not important at all the way up to 3 being this is very important to me. And the first thing you might notice is that the services, the positive attributes of trees, are ranked more highly than the disservices of trees. This is really common across pretty much any tree survey you'll ever come across in the literature. What people like about trees, they like a lot more than what they dislike about trees. And so what we found in Salt Lake City, that the shading the tree provided and the beauty a tree provided were really the 2 most important attributes of trees. And the third being that trees create an area to relax and to enjoy people's yard. Much less important was whether or not the tree provided fruit, whether the tree was aromatic, and things like did it spread pollen or reduce visibility at night. What's interesting to me is that trees, whether or not a tree flowered, was much less important. So it really seems that when people are thinking about flowering plants, they're really focusing on maybe smaller herbaceous plants. So then we correlated how the ranked importance of these traits with the total number of trees we found in the Salt Lake Valley that had these traits. And we found a nice positive correlation. So there were lots of shade trees that provided shade, and that was the most important attribute to residents. There were lots of trees that had low water use and did not drop debris, which is also really important to residents. There were very few trees that provided fruit, and provision of fruit was not important. And there were very few trees that did not spread pollen or were aromatic. And again, these attributes were not very important to people. So this really suggests that people are planting the urban forest that they desire. And finally, we wanted to look into the effect of income. And so again, we found that everyone wanted colorful yards regardless of income, but not everyone was able to realize these colorful yards. And this suggests that income potentially is limiting the ability of people to realize their preferences in Salt Lake Valley. So here we really dove into commercial viability. Again, we really found that commercial viability could be strongly affecting patterns of urban biodiversity. If you have more money and you're going to a locally owned nursery where trees are much more expensive, you're choosing from a much larger species pool than if you go to a cheaper box store. We found that manager species selections are really important in structuring yard biodiversity. People are growing the yards that they generally want. And so from Salt Lake City, what are the insights? We found that residential income was more important than neighborhood age for biodiversity. Residents want color variety, and we think that might be driving high yard biodiversity. Residents plant trees with traits they desire. We think that nurseries could be a driving source of urban biodiversity patterns, and that money does enable residents to realize their yard preferences. So for the final section of this talk, I'm going to take you to where I live now in Baltimore on the East Coast. I'm originally from New York. I'm an East Coaster. For those of you who are familiar with the US, the East Coast is pretty humid and I love humidity. I did not like living in the West, it's just not my place. So I'm very happy to be back on the East Coast and doing research here in Baltimore. So I don't have Baltimore has been colonized for so long, there's no pictures before it was strongly urbanized. So here's a painting of what Baltimore looked like in its early days of colonization. And here's a picture of Baltimore today. What I'd like you to notice is that there actually was a lot of trees here in Baltimore before it was urbanized. And now there's much fewer trees. And so what Baltimore is doing, while in Los Angeles and Salt Lake City, they're planting and bringing in trees, what Baltimore is doing is actually removing vegetation or removing trees in its process of urbanization. And so in Baltimore, again, I want to really drill into these questions of human behavior, and I want to focus on 2 different resources that people have and how that affects patterns of biodiversity. And so I consider time to garden a resource, right? If you have more time to spend in your yard, it could affect your biodiversity patterns. And in Salt Lake City, we learned that income is a really big resource. So I want to dive into the effects of time and money and how that affects biodiversity patterns in Baltimore yards. And for this, I collaborate with Allison Blanchette and Nancy Santi and Dexter Locke. So for this research, we went to 12 neighborhoods across Baltimore City and County. We stratified neighborhoods by the age of the residents. So for this, we used a, what's it called? Oh, tapestry segments, which is part of marketing campaigns about you could figure out where to send mailers. So it's all for ways to send advertisement, but we can use this information to learn things about the residents. And so we chose 2 of their segments, one called Middle Ground, which were generally people that were going to be younger and working, potentially having kids, and then one called Senior Styles, and these were people that tended to be older and retired. And then within these 2 tapestry segments, and within people that we are going to assume are going to have more or less time to garden, depending on whether you're retired or still working, we had 2 monetary ranges, either having a higher income or a middle range income. In Baltimore, the very low income yards don't have, the low income houses do not have yards, so we didn't look at those. We also controlled for property age and property size in this study. And we collected, again, both social data and plant data, similar to how things were designed in the Salt Lake City study. And so here are just 4 examples of yards we went to. Here is a yard of someone that has high income and is retired. Here's the yard that, again, had higher income but was working. You can see here that clearly there's signs of having kids. Here is a middle income yard, then the people are retired, and here is a middle income yard and the people were working. We found really high levels of biodiversity across Baltimore. We found 89 tree species, 82 species growing in lawns, and 80 flowering plant genera. Just a second, I'm going to close my door. They're doing yard work outside. And then we tried to understand what are the relative effects. We ran ANCOVA models, taking into account the fixed effect of the income of the neighborhood and the tapestry category, or people working or not, to try to explain patterns of biodiversity with yard size as a covariate. And so we found that having money was more important than having more time for both the number of tree species that we found, where you see the high income has a higher intercept, and the number of flowering plant species that we found. And generally, which shouldn't be surprising, larger yards were able to support higher amounts of biodiversity. We also found that higher income yards were more colorful. This is very similar to what we found in Salt Lake City. I don't know if you remember the Salt Lake City palette very well, but there really weren't these blue colors. But here in, we have a different color palette in Baltimore than what we found in Salt Lake City. We have some more blues and greens and less yellows and pinks than was found in Salt Lake City, which is just an aside, interesting that the color palette that people see differs by where you are in the country. But again, you really see there's a much higher area that's in color in Baltimore than in the high income yards than in middle income yards. And we found that life stage is important for flower color area. And so people that were older had more color, had more area of their yard in color. And we think this could suggest learned traits where you learn how to keep plants flowering longer by doing things like deadheading and picking the dead bugs, the dead flowers. And so we think this really does potentially show that you learn how to garden over the course of your lifetime. We also just asked everyone about how much time they spend in their yard and how they care for their yard. And this was now regardless of their income, the neighborhood categories. We just did correlations between everybody and their responses on these surveys. And so we asked people if they fertilize their lawn, if they add pesticide or herbicide, and if they rake. And we said 0 is no, they don't. 1 is yes, they do. And for overall lawn species richness, we found it does not matter what people do to their yards. On average, people have about 12 species growing in their lawn in Baltimore. These are really weedy lawns in Baltimore, and I think they're really beautiful and fun to look at. But we didn't really find a strong effect of yard management affecting lawn species richness. But we did find that people that spent more time gardening tended to have more flowering plants, more flowering plant in general, and more floral colors. And so this, we don't know if this is that they spent time gardening and then that they were able to do this, or that they're just more interested in gardening. And then because they're more interested in it, their yards had these attributes. We can't really tease that apart, but there is certainly some type of relationship. And so here from the work in Baltimore, we really find that human behavior does really affect overall urban biodiversity. And it is an important and complex driver. And so what we learned from Baltimore, we found that money is more important than life stage for biodiversity patterns. Life stage was important for the number of flowers, potentially suggesting learned gardening techniques. And residents that spent more time gardening had more yard vegetation. And so that's all the data I want to present. Before I end the talk, I just want to revisit the filters framework that I introduced earlier. And so I hope I've somewhat convinced you that this filters framework is useful and can help inform patterns of urban biodiversity. And I want to just think about when there's great heterogeneity across the urban landscape. And I want to go back to thinking about what we learned in Los Angeles. We had very different types of land management. And we think we have further hypotheses about how different land management could have different filter processes. So in remnant natural areas that are really minimally managed, we think that all the species are pretty much coming in through the spontaneous species, regional species pool, and there is no filter for manager preferences because people are just letting plants grow there. And so the local environment is really important and biotic interactions are really important. Then we can think about low managed areas. Low managed areas could be things like road medians or park lawns, places where there is some level of management, but not very intense. We think that again, in these areas, most of the species are going to be spontaneous, but there will also be some cultivated species. That manager species selections are there, but we think it's a fairly weak filter. And instead, the local environment and biotic interactions are stronger filters. And finally, we can think about really intensely managed areas like our residential yards that I presented on today, where we think manager species, where we think first, most of the species are human imported and coming from a global species pool through commercial viability, and a smaller amount are spontaneous species. And we think that manager species selections is a pretty strong filter, with the local environment and biotic interactions being weaker filters and the role of human behavior being really strong. And so when we think about a city, I really only focus on plants today, but plants are not the only things in cities. We also have vertebrates, invertebrates, microbes, and fungi that all interact and affect one another. And I really think we need to think holistically about what we find in cities if we want to understand patterns of biodiversity. So I do think community assembly can be understood when we really focus and drill down onto human behaviors. And we as humans, we're creating these entirely novel and built ecosystems. And I'd like to end us with a question of merely what kind of environment do we want to live in? Because we are ultimately creating these spaces. With that, I'd really like to thank you for inviting me to come talk to you and for your time, and all my co-authors and people that have helped me in the field. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.